Our group did our presentation on biodiversity loss. First of all, it's important to understand what is biodiversity. Basically, it's about species richness. That basically means that it refers to the number of species within an area. Specifically, it can refer to the number of genes or even the biological communities that are in that particular area. It can range from very, very, very small ecosystems to the global biosphere. So basically, you're looking at the species that are within a particular area and looking at how many there are or the richness of that species. So now we're going to be able to explain what the loss of biodiversity is. It's basically the opposite of biodiversity, hence the name loss of biodiversity. It's basically the decrease in that genetic variability. And so it's also a decrease in the number of communities in that area because there's less species. So then, of course, there's less diversity, which means that there's a loss of it. And eventually leads to things such as extinction because there's, of course, a loss in that number of that particular organism or as well as the species as a whole. Biodiversity can lead to many negative things. For example, it can lead to a decrease in the functioning of an ecosystem in that area. That basically means that if there's less of that particular species, then there's less functioning of that species within that area, which leads to a decrease in the functioning of that ecosystem because there's less of that species within that particular area. Another example of what biodiversity can lead to is males and females, less mating is going on, which means that there's a decrease in that population. Also, the role that a species plays is diminished because there's a decrease in the functional ecosystem because there's a loss of biodiversity within an ecosystem.
How does biodiversity loss work? How does it happen? The answer varies on the type of biodiversity. There are 3 levels of biodiversity, and the first is genetic diversity. This can be different genetic variations in a population or different genetic variations between populations. Genetic diversity between populations can depend on different ways populations adapt to their environments. This could be different fur colors for camouflage, different beak shapes, longer tongues, or brighter colors to attract bees. A loss of genetic diversity could impact the microevolution of a species. If microevolution doesn't occur, then the population could suffer from not being able to adapt to different factors. The second level of biodiversity is species diversity. This refers to the different species in an area. Biodiversity loss for species can be caused by extinction. This can be extinction of a local population, meaning the species in a certain area, or global extinction. It is very scary to think about the number of endangered species in the world, or the number of threatened species, which means species that are very close to being considered endangered. The picture on the slide here is a St. Helena olive tree. And St. Helena olive tree was declared extinct in 2004. And it is really worrisome to think about how extinction happens in modern days. And it's not just, and the dodo bird was extinct. It could happen to any endangered species nowadays. And this St. Helena olive tree went extinct from destruction of their ecosystems, which is the third level of biodiversity. Ecosystem diversity is the different ecosystems different species live in. The loss of ecosystems can cause species diversity loss, which can cause genetic diversity loss. Ecosystems are heavily affected by humans, of course, but ecosystem diversity loss can be caused by endangered species as well, or loss of species. One example is, of course, the coral reefs. Coral reefs are separate from ocean biomes. They're usually very shallow and in tropical areas. Coral reefs are affected by climate change and also pollution in the ocean. One reason coral reefs are being affected is because of the loss of coral itself. Coral is an animal and it provides different things for the different species in the ecosystems. For example, coral dies and therefore it is a species diversity loss, which of course affects the ecosystem of coral reefs, which the loss of the ecosystem affects different species besides just coral. For example, fish that hide in the coral, or fish that hunt in the coral, or fish that use the coral as stabilization for feeding. And another way that ecosystems are endangered or the biodiversity loss happens is by non-native plants. The ecosystems aren't made for the non-native plants, and therefore the non-native plants consume different parts of the ecosystem.
So now that you kind of got the general idea of like what biodiversity is, it does beg the question, is this important? What kind of relevance does this have to our day-to-day lives? And I cannot stress this enough. Yes, it is very important. I cannot overstate that. So a huge reason why it's important is what biodiversity provides to us. So to start, biodiversity can do a lot of things for an ecosystem itself. It can provide a lot of services to it, if you will. So when biodiversity increases, the amount of species and genes in the pool also increases. So these different species can have different functions or different roles. So some of them might be able to protect water pH or irrigate the water in different directions, or soil protection and production is huge. Another thing is climate stability. So again, like plants and stuff can take the heat out of the air and control a climate that way. So that's the like the system services that it provides. So on top of that, there's also biological resources. So an increase in biodiversity could be an increase in the food that ecosystem produces, the wood resources, the medicinal resources. This is huge. Medicine plays a huge part in our lives, and there's a whole bunch of different rare and unknown plants out there that can provide a whole lot of different medicine and that can treat a whole lot of different things, maybe things that we don't even know are treatable yet. So medicine is huge. And then livestock and gene diversity are also resources that can be increased with an increase of biodiversity. Another thing is definitely not as important as the others, but there's also a social benefit aspect from it. So there's research and education that can be done on all these different living organisms and stuff. We're currently doing research and education on it right now. Obviously, tourism is a big thing. And then on top of that, there's also recreation, so going out into the lakes and stuff like that. I picked this quote right here because I really liked how it tied everything together. The richer the richer the diversity of life, the greater the opportunity for adaptive responses to new challenges. So let's say the more different types of plants we have, and the higher opportunity that we'll have an adaptive response to like a new virus or something like that. And that included a picture of the nitrogen cycle here. And so effects of biodiversity loss. So decreasing populations get hit hard. So if a population is getting very small for a certain species, then the biodiversity loss hits that even harder than regular. And then on top of that, there's extinction and endangerment. That's kind of self-explanatory. Uh, Ecosystems act on food webs. So if you take out one piece of the food web, then obviously that has a huge effect on other things. If you take out something's natural predator, then a whole bunch more will probably be found. Or if there's a whole bunch of something, then a natural predator will come in. And so that's they act on food webs. So biodiversity loss, um, taking out parts of the food web could make it all crumble. And so an ecosystem could collapse. And what this kind of means is that let's say you have a tropical forest and you lose all the biodiversity in that tropical forest. Well, that's going to turn into like a barren wasteland, or maybe you could turn it into like a crop field or urban development. But it will no longer be able to be a tropical forest anymore. And so this declines the ecosystem productivity, obviously. Um, the products that humans depend on could cause economic collapse as well. so big farm and food and stuff like that. Obviously, with less of that, there's less money in the system, and with no food, we'd also probably die pretty easily. So I guess we wouldn't really matter about the money. But yes, that's kind of the effects that biodiversity loss has. Thank you.
So, what creates biodiversity loss? Well, disturbances such as natural disasters or human activity can alter the number of organisms or resources in a community. Altering a community's resources can affect the survival of a species, which can then affect a gene pool within a community. This is called bottleneck effect, where natural disasters can cause a significant change or a loss in genetic variation in a gene pool. When resources are altered or reduced, this can cause species to migrate to other environments. This can create a founder effect, where a group of organisms migrate to a new location and lose genetic variation. The examples of disturbances that can cause biodiversity loss will be talked about, which we will be talking about, is loss and fragmentation of natural habitats, climate change, the presence of an invasive species, and harvesting and agriculture. The loss and fragmentation of natural habitats can cause biodiversity loss, as you can see in this slide. The loss and fragmentation of natural habitats can be caused by urbanization, construction of infrastructure, or tourism. Fragmentation of natural habitats is a process where habitats are transformed from a large landmass to smaller patches of land that are isolated from each other. When a species experiences this change, they will move to these isolated habitats, which can cause a smaller population, in which a smaller population can be at risk for genetic drift. Urbanization, tourism, and infrastructure being a cause of biodiversity loss can be observed in a study in Palo Alto, California, where in the city with more tourism, infrastructure, and urbanization, there was only 7 different species of birds, but in areas outside the city, there were at least 21 species of birds. This observation shows us that the urbanization can reduce the amount of species and diversity in an environment. Climate change can also be a disturbance that can cause biodiversity loss. Climate change is able to decrease genetic diversity of populations due to directional selection and rapid migration. Directional selection can occur in a species because individuals who are able to sustain themselves in a higher temperature are going to be the ones that are able to survive and reproduce successfully. Rapid migration can occur as animals migrate to environments where they are able to survive in. This can cause genetic drift, as spoken on the previous slide, as well as founder effect. Rapid migration can cause changes in the geographic distribution of a species. Both directional selection and rapid migration can alter biodiversity. Climate change will especially affect species that live in isolated or distinct habitats. This is because species in these kind of habitats will have a harder time migrating than most. According to a journal article on climate change, the rise in global temperature will result in a 15 to 37% of species becoming endangered by 2050. The impact of an invasive species can create biodiversity loss. An invasive species is a species that can cause harm to other species in an environment that it is not native to. An invasive species can create biodiversity loss by creating competition with native species for limited resources. This competition can lead to the endangerment or the extinction of native species. An example of how an invasive species can cause biodiversity loss is how the predation of feral cats and red foxes in Australia led to the decline and extinction of 2/3 of Australia's digging mammal species. This has led to an impoverished landscape due to the reduction of disturbance in the topsoil, which is because of the absence of the mammal digging species. Harvesting in agriculture can create biodiversity loss by affecting the environment of many species. A lot of natural habitats are being converted into farms and pasture for agriculture. This loss in natural habitats can cause a species to migrate or become threatened. Another way that harvesting in agriculture can create biodiversity loss is through the use of pesticides and fertilizer. Pesticides and fertilizer can seep into the soil, affecting the species who depend on the soil for nutrients. When the soil becomes polluted with these substances, this can ruin the natural habitat and ecosystem for many species, which can lead to endangerment.
So, some of the ways that biodiversity loss can be prevented can be just typical ways to decrease global warming or just to improve the environment, such as recycling, being able to use better fuel options and carpool, stuff like that, that would just decrease any type of global warming or any harmful things in the environment. But some specific things can be things such as species interventions, genetic intervention, habitat protection, habitat connections, and habitat management. So some species interventions could also be understood as protective custody, and protective custody is important in plant conservation such as botanic gardens, which can grow rare plants and protect them until they are able to be planted into the wild and then reproduce on their own. For animals, this can fall under zoos. I know a lot of people are against zoos, but zoos aren't always bad. And zoos are able to provide important refuge for animals that are endangered or injured until they're ready to go back into the wild. Getting into genetic intervention, these can include animals in the zoo as well, and the zookeepers can often breed these animals, and they are able to breed the ones that have been proved to be good at reproducing at a young age. Then habitat protection could go into reserves that can be placed in places of hotspots of biodiversity where vulnerable species are concentrated, and then a large fraction of those species might be saved because of these reserves. Habitat connections are habitats that are not completely destroyed, but they can be fragmented to the degree that individuals can be connected by wildfire corridors. So these places can be connected to each other, and then they can reproduce while being connected. Lastly, habitat management. These can go into anything. So like habitats can be managed to maintain the threatened species within them. So some of these things that can be maintained are fire control and flood control. So if you just have people looking over these and being able to control them, then there would be less likelihood of these habitats getting destroyed or going into extinction.